Hello, guys. There is a little issue that we have to explain a little bit that we left behind when we talked about the circulatory system, and it has to do with the role of the capillaries, okay, and how the capillaries exchange substances between blood and the tissues, right? The other day we talked about the presence of an internal environment, and this will be very important to understand. Okay, so first of all, let us revise a little bit what are capillaries, what kind of vessels they are. Here we have a very, very simple scheme of the double circulatory system. You must remember we have seen it, where we have the arteries. Arteries come out from the heart, they branch out into capillaries. Those capillaries collect together into veins, which return to the heart. And the same happens in the pulmonary circulation, where the artery takes the blood from the heart, they branch out again into capillaries and collect again into veins. So the capillaries are those tinier vessels, yes, through which blood circulates. Where? Well, basically in the organs. Okay, so this structure that you can see, that network that you see there, is present within the liver, inside the structure of the liver, right? The artery brings blood to the liver, the capillaries branch out inside the liver, right? And then they collect into veins. The same happens in the gut, that is the stomach, the intestine. It happens in the kidneys, and it happens in any other organ where uh, there are living cells. Here you have a very, very simple, but at the same time very clear diagram that represents the capillary network inside a tissue. On one side, we have the arterioles bringing blood into the tissue. Remember, the arterioles are the smallest of arteries, okay? There are a couple of mistakes in this diagram that we could discuss later on. But then arteries bring blood into the capillaries, right? Remember that the blood that they bring is at a high pressure, right? And the blood leaves the tissue through the venules. And so the blood circulates through the system, right, between the arteries and the veins, between the arterioles, more precisely, and the venules, right? Also, all these structures that you can see here are the capillaries. And what is it particular about them? First of all, that between the cells in the tissue, this could be any tissue in the body, the liver, the lungs, the stomach, a muscle, okay, any tissue in the body is made of its cells, and between the cells there are some tiny spaces, some not so tiny as you can see here, right? But usually very, very tiny spaces between the cells. And what is most important is that capillaries, the most important characteristic of capillaries, beyond their size, yes, if you take a look, this is a red blood cell. Capillaries are very tiny. If we consider that red blood cells are pretty tiny cells, the most important characteristic of capillaries is that their walls have got gaps. Okay, we will see the function of these gaps in a minute. Okay, so far we just take that into account. I said that this diagram had a couple of mistakes. The first idea is that arteries, the light, the lumen of the arteries should be much narrower than the lumen of the veins. Yes, as the blood in the veins, in this case in the venules, is at a very low pressure, the veins should be much wider to allow more blood to return. Okay, and the wall of the arterioles should be much thicker, yes, rich in muscle cells. Remember that arterioles have the capacity to open and close, right? What we call vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which is something you will see in these weeks, okay? But before we go on with what happens in the capillary network, sorry, and the other mistake is that there is a red blood cell here outside the capillaries. That could never happen. or else if it happens, it means there is bleeding, okay? A red blood cell away outside a vessel, artery, capillary, vein, means a bleeding, okay? And that's no good in any case, all right? But let us forget about those mistakes. And I said, let us return to some characteristics of blood, okay? And the most important characteristic is, which are the different components of blood? Let us list them down. This would be very good to do it in class with all of you together and asking you to remember these components, but let us do it in this way, right? I want you to pay attention to the order in which we will be mentioning the components of blood. The first one is the cells, okay? White cells, red cells, platelets, okay? They are cells which basically are floating or moving actively. Remember, white cells have the capacity, some white cells, phagocytes particularly, have the capacity to move there, all right? But then complex structures, huge structures in chemical terms. A very important component of blood is proteins, proteins that are soluble, okay? Unlike the very large proteins that make up our muscles, for example, these proteins are soluble and they are typically floating in the blood liquid, yes, with very particular purposes. We know very well antibodies, that are those missiles the lymphocytes, the white cells, shoot against pathogens, right? Once they recognize them. Remember that antibodies are specific. They have the shape, the complementary shape of the antigens of the pathogens. Enzymes that could be there in blood to carry out certain particular functions, that certain particular chemical reactions that must happen in the blood. There are not many. Sometimes these enzymes show the activity of other cells, cells that have broken, for example, the finding of certain enzymes, intracellular enzymes in the blood would mean that something is happening to certain cells. Carriers, because there are several substances that are transported in blood which are insoluble in water, and so they need to be transported. A simple image to understand this function could be a basket, okay? Yes, a wooden basket or something of that. That is something that at the same time can float, yes, but it could hold something inside, okay? Right? Anything. I mean, you could make a basket full of stones float in a river. Well, the same would happen in this case. These proteins, the albumin is the name of one of these proteins. These proteins carry substances like fats or insoluble minerals like calcium, yes, inside, and that those substances travel through the blood. You might have heard of cholesterol, which is one of the lipids, one of the very important lipids that we find in our body. That is very important to build up, for example, cell membranes. Cholesterol is also very important to build up hormones, right? The sexual hormones, for example, are made from cholesterol. But the problem is the excess of cholesterol. And you might have heard of the good and bad cholesterol. In very simple terms, the good cholesterol would be the cholesterol that is carried properly inside proteins, okay, inside these carriers. And the last type of protein that we should mention, and we should mention it in terms of the functions of blood, is fibrinogen, whose main function is to clot blood. When there is a wound in one of the vessels, okay, when a vessel breaks, when blood starts escaping, fibrinogen turns into fibrin, that is a protein that basically forms a network that doesn't let blood get out, okay? And that's the crust that some people take out when you have a wound, okay? Another component of blood is the hormones that we will talk about very soon. There are substances that carry information, okay, or more than information, instructions, okay? They are orders, let us say, yes, that travel through the blood, substances that have that function traveling through the blood. I mention them here because a few of those hormones are proteins as well. Some of the hormones, as I said before, are lipidic components, etc. The fundamental component of blood is nutrients, okay, among which these are the two most important: glucose, amino acids, yes, to build up, to break down, to obtain energy, to build up future proteins inside the cells, right? But also vitamins, all right, and other substances that are transported in blood, yes, obviously, because they need to be got rid of from the cells, is some waste compounds or waste components, waste substances. One that we will be very acquainted with is called urea, and it's better if you hear it from it. And finally, mineral salts, a very big concentration of mineral salts is dissolved in blood as much as in the cytoplasm of cells, okay? There is a very big, great importance of the balance between the concentration of these components and the components of the cytoplasm. Remember that these substances might be able to diffuse freely from one place to the other, okay? And so it is very important that the concentration is balanced, okay? Much of the pH of blood depends on these minerals, okay? So this is another very important function of minerals, to regulate the pH of the blood. Obviously, water, which is the solvent that carries them all these things are carried in water, including the substances that are carried in protein carriers. And finally, gases, carbon dioxide, oxygen, but a lot of nitrogen too that can diffuse in the lungs. Remember, 80% of the air is nitrogen, okay? Now, if you have already realized the order in which these things have been, the components of blood have been mentioned, has to do with the size of the particles, okay? Obviously, cells are much bigger than any of these, okay? And carbon dioxide, oxygen, you just have to remember the formula, the chemical formula of these substances, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, to realize that they are extremely tiny compared to cells, okay? Then there is another difference that is very important, that is all these are substances. Whether cells are much more complex structures, yes, that are much more complex, made of several substances organized in a certain way, okay? But all the rest in that blue group, let us say, are the substances. These are what we call blood plasma, okay? So the main two categories in blood are plasma and the cells, all right? But among these, there is a huge difference. If already, I mean, some of these substances are very, very tiny, there is a huge difference. If there is a difference between a cell and a protein, I mean, a cell is made of millions and millions and millions of molecules of proteins. A protein is at the same time many, many, many times bigger than any of these components. Yeah, even glucose and amino acids. Remember that a protein is not made of less than 100 amino acids joined together. Okay, so a protein might be 100 times bigger already than this group. Okay, why is this important? This group of substances beyond proteins are the substances that might be able to leave blood. Where through? Through the gaps we talked about before when we were looking at the capillaries, and that is what we will see in a second. Okay, so these substances are very tiny compared to proteins, because although glucose is 20 times bigger than a molecule of oxygen, or 12 times bigger than a molecule of water or anything, they are still much tinier than proteins. And these substances form what we call tissue fluid. And why do we call them tissue fluid? We need to go back to the scheme of the capillary network. okay, in a tissue. Remember, this represents any of the tissues in the body, okay? This more or less represents any of the tissues in the body and the capillary network running through them, all right? We must remember that capillaries have got gaps, and you must remember that the arterioles bring this blood at a high pressure. So when the blood reaches the capillary network, some of this fluid, the one we mentioned before as tissue fluid, you can rewind a little bit and read which are the components, can escape from the blood, some of which will not be able to escape. I mean, cells will not be able to escape, and the largest proteins will not be able to escape, and they will remain always in blood, but the rest of the components will be able to escape. And I pressed a little bit too fast. They will move through the tissue, through those intercellular gaps, intercellular spaces that I pointed out in the other picture, all right, flowing through the tissue, and they will be able to return to the blood at the end of a capillary network. What do I mean by at the end? Well, next to the veins, next to the venules, all right? And why will they be able to return? Because as much of the tissue fluid has escaped from the blood, when the blood gets to the last part of the capillaries, to the last capillaries, the pressure here is very, very low. The pressure in the capillaries is very low. And so the tissue fluid will return to the blood. What will happen in the meantime? In the meantime, the oxygen that was dissolved in the tissue fluid will diffuse into the cells, and the carbon dioxide that was in the cells will diffuse into the tissue fluid. And so when that tissue fluid returns to the blood, it will be rich in carbon dioxide, poor in oxygen. It will be poor in glucose because the glucose and the amino acids will have stayed in the cells, and will be very rich in waste materials, okay, other waste materials, right? What is the most important concept of all this? That the cells are continuously bathed in a liquid. Our cells, gentlemen, are aquatic. They live in the water, in a water environment, okay? The internal environment of our cells, if we are terrestrial and we would say aerial animals, that is, we are surrounded by air and we stand on the soil, right? uh, our cells are still aquatic, okay? They are surrounded by liquid, all right? And they are not directly surrounded by blood. They are surrounded by one of the part of the component of blood that is what we mentioned before as tissue fluid. Revise, go backwards and revise which are those components. I think that with this explanation, you will have enough to be able to understand what we what happens with the internal environment and with a concept that will be extremely important from now on, that is called homeostasis. Goodbye.